The gospel reading is Luke chapter 9, beginning with the 28th verse. Now about 8 days after these sayings, he took with him Peter and John and James and went up on the mountain to pray. As he was praying, the appearance of his countenance was altered, and his raiment became dazzling white. And behold, two men talked with him, Moses and Elijah, who appeared in glory and spoke of his departure, which he was to accomplish at Jerusalem. Now Peter and those who were with him were heavy with sleep. And when they wakened, they saw his glory and the two men who stood with him. And as the men were parting from him, Peter said to Jesus, Master, it's well that we are here. Let us make 3 booths, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah, not knowing what he said. As he said this, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were afraid as they entered the cloud. And a voice came out of the cloud saying, This is my son, my chosen. Listen to him. And when the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone. And they kept their silence and told no one of those days anything of what they had seen. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God.
So Transfiguration Sunday is typically before Lent, before Ash Wednesday, which will be this upcoming Wednesday. Just in terms of order of happenings, following the Transfiguration, Jesus is shortly led to Jerusalem for the last time, where he will undergo suffering and eventual death. So in many ways, it's as if Transfiguration is a ways in which God is reaffirming to the disciples, Peter, John, and James, and others eventually. This is a way of God reaffirming for us that Jesus is indeed who he says he is. That you can trust Jesus at his words. That though you may go through some things, ultimately God's will be done. So Transfiguration Sunday. You have Peter, John, and James, and Jesus. They ascend a mountain, and there Jesus is illuminated. He's glorified. We see Elijah and Moses beside Jesus. A voice from the heaven comes. Voice, God says, This is my son, the chosen, the beloved. Listen to him. Listen to him. So today, in light of our passage, I wanted to highlight 3 different aspects of what we've just read. One is praying, the other sleeping, the third listening. Praying, sleeping, listening. On any given day, you do all 3 of those things. It's a pretty full day. So unlike Matthew and Mark's account, in Luke, we see transfiguration in the context of Jesus' prayer. He's praying. All throughout biblical narrative, there's importance of prayer. Especially in Luke, every major marks of Jesus' life, there's prayer. His baptism, Jesus' ministry, and the cross. There's always prayer. Jesus prays as if to suggest that there is an intimate connection between prayer and divine intercession. There's a connection between prayer and divine revelation. John Wesley, the founder of United Methodist movement, he believed that prayer was such an essential part of our Christian discipleship. He writes that God does nothing but an answer to prayer. You've heard me share some stories about my grandfather on my father's side. He graduated elementary school, but I'm not even sure if he actually went into middle school. As soon as he was big enough and strong enough, he worked to support his family. So by the time I came of age, I'd see him work, I'd see him take care of his grandkids. And whenever he wasn't working or playing with the grandkids, he was reading the Bible and praying. I asked him one day, Granddad, why do you read the Bible so much? He said, because I want to know the heart of my God. I want to know more about the will of my God. So I asked him, well, Grandpa, why do you pray so much? And he said, well, because I'm not exactly sure what I'm reading in the Bible at the moment. Yeah? He must have been reading Leviticus, Deuteronomy, Numbers. Take your pick. So as such, Jesus prays often. And all the while, you notice, while Jesus is praying, his disciples, Peter, John, and James, they're asleep. They're sleeping. Perhaps their sleepiness symbolizes the difficulty, in part by the disciples, to fully grasp the mission of Jesus, even to the very end, at least until the resurrection. Their weariness is kind of an evidence of them not fully getting it in ways of who Jesus is, why Jesus came, and who Jesus calls them to be. It's hard for them understanding and to live into that calling. The Greek word for sleep here is hypnos. Hypnos, it means sleep, slumber. It also can be translated as unconsciousness. So there is this literal sense of physical exhaustion and therefore sleep. But the word can also signify this notion of spiritual weariness, spiritual drowsiness. And Paul in Romans chapter 13 writes, it is time to wake from sleep. Henry David Thoreau, I should say, he had that famous quote of, massive men live their lives in quiet desperation. What are they all saying? They're not talking about physical sleep as much as so many of us sleepwalk through life without much awareness, purpose, intentionality. Paul is saying, wake up from your spiritual slumber, from your drowsiness, and to live as Jesus called you to live. I don't think I've shared this story before. A couple of churches ago in a small town in eastern part of the state, it was a lovely community of Christians there, and there was one gentleman, let's call him Nate. He and his family, they were there every Sunday. Nate was there as long as he was in town, he was in worship. He owned a construction company, very small one, mom and pop kind of construction company that he did with his son-in-law. He would work most weekends, but he was there every Sunday. And most Sundays that he was there, he would also fall asleep. I took no offense, but he did sleep far more often during my sermon than any other part of the service. And he would sleep loudly, After a particular Sunday, his wife must have said something to him, and let's call him Nate. Nate said, Uiyeon, I'm really sorry that I fell asleep again. And I told Nate, I'll be honest with you, I'm so grateful that you would choose to sleep in the house of the Lord than in the comforts of your own bed. I'm honored. Because you could have stayed home, but you chose to be here. You felt safe. You chose to sleep in the house of God. So friends, whether it be here or elsewhere, please know that this preacher is perfectly okay you falling asleep in the house of God. I'd rather have you here asleep than at home. And I would not be offended, maybe a little, if you should fall asleep during the sermon. I'll be honest with you, it is without a doubt, by following Jesus, being a disciple of Jesus, have brought me so much more peace and joy and assurance and purpose than I could have ever dreamed otherwise. But I also, at times, I get weary. Being a disciple can be difficult, tiring. Can you relate? I can get weary from time to time. I can also relate to what the disciples are going through, why they are asleep as they are. Karl Marx had this famous quote that religion is the opium of the masses. And at first glance, it sounds sophisticated and fancy enough. But that is so wrong, wrong, wrong. It's so wrong. David Brooks, who's a famed author, journalist, and a professor at Yale, he talked about his journey from being an atheist to his conversion to following Jesus. And he talked about how wrong Marx was. He said, I'll be honest with you, when I was an atheist, my life was so much easier. I slept so much better. I was accountable to no one, responsible for nothing other than what I deemed to be responsible. I lived by my own will. Then I started to follow Jesus. And it complicated my life because it was no longer about my will, but about God's will. Baked into our faith, there is something called carrying your cross and following Jesus. So Brooks talked about how his life got so much more fuller and more beautiful, but at times far more difficult than it would have been otherwise. Following Jesus requires a certain sense of courage, bravery, and at times it can be weary. So that leads to listening. Jesus says, listen. God says, this is my son, the chosen one, listen. The Greek word here is akouos, root word akouos. It's an imperative command. The more accurate translation would be something along the line of, this is my chosen one, keep listening to him. It's not one and done. It's not just about hearing or even understanding, but it's about obeying, doing, following over and over and over again. Keep listening to him. So let me ask you, who do you listen to and why? Did you ever think about that? We live in a time, now more than ever, where there are so many competing voices vying for our attention and our loyalty. So who do you listen to and why? Who do you listen to? When it comes to the science of who we listen to, why we listen to them, there's a multitude of wonderful research. Some part of a strain of thought, part of the research talks about how there is a correlation, pretty close correlation between trust and social status. So meaning, if certain people rise to a certain place within our society, we implicitly trust them, trusting that they got to where they are for good reasons, that they've earned their stripes, so to speak. And there's nothing wrong with that. I also, at times, believe in that, practice that. But here's also a different way to think about trust and listening, why we listen to certain voices over the other. Once again, there are a variety of wonderful research on this, but one of the more famous of the ones in these last decade or two is Brené Brown. She talks about how we trust and listen to those most who are authentic and vulnerable. Those who are authentic and vulnerable. And I talk about my parents from time to time. I'm 40 plus years old now, and over these 40 plus years, my parents and I, we've had wonderful times of laughter. We've had plenty of times of disagreements. We've had our share of fights. We've had our shares of tears over the years and some beautiful memories in between. And I don't know how else to say this, but I like to think that at least half the time I know what I'm doing. I have decent intelligence to figure things out. So hypothetically, because this actually kind of happened about 20 years ago, let's say that I decide on a particular day, Uiyeon, I'm going to go east. Why? Who cares? But I'm going to go east. I've determined and discerned I'm going to go east. But if my parents said, Uiyeon, you really ought to go west. Although I think I know what I'm doing and what I'm talking about half the time, at least, you know what I'll do? I'm going to go west. Why? Because for over 40 plus years, I've witnessed to my parents' authenticity and vulnerability. They have shown me love that surpasses understanding. They've made sacrifices for me and so many others, ways in which that I can dream of doing in my own life for those whom I love. So I trust them. So though I think I should go east and have discerned as such, if my parents tell me, Uiyeon, you ought to go west, I'm going west. I'm going west. Unless my wife tells me to go east. Then we're all going east. Jesus, God incarnate, the fullness of manifestation of God's vulnerability and authenticity for God's people, for us, with us. On this Transfiguration Sunday, this very God says, "This is my Son. You can trust him. This is the chosen, the beloved. You can trust him." There might be some suffering, yes, and even death along the way. You can trust him. Keep listening to him. Follow him and do as he says. And my chosen one, my beloved, will save your life. He'll save the world. Thanks be to God. Amen.